Hey everyone, I'm Alex. I just want to talk to you really quickly about Toyvention. This is a program that we're running. It's actually going to be a workshop that we're going to do the following Saturday. So Toyvention is we're going to get together. We're going to buy a bunch of toys, electronic toys, and we're going to modify them so that disabled kids, kids that can actually manipulate the switches and the little parts of toys, will basically are going to graft larger switches onto them so that the kids will be able to use these toys. And it's very important for these kids to be able to use toys like this. It gives them, basically, it's like therapy. It kind of teaches them cause and effect. It actually helps them with some problems that like kids with motor control issues have. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to start at 10. We're going to show up. We're going to have people there to train, to teach you how to take apart toys, to solder. There's going to be a lot of interesting skills about like making things, taking things apart, putting them back together again. And it's all going to be for a good cause. There's two ways you can help. The first thing you can do, and the thing actually I'm most interested in right now, is you can go to this site, which is theedney.com. There's two E's, one for the and one for the Edney, and Toyvention. There will be a link on there to sign up to volunteer for Saturday. That would be great. You can come for 2 hours. You can come for 6 hours, however long you want to come. Like kids over 10, we love to have everyone, all ages. Under that, they're probably too young, but kids over 10 with some adult supervision would be great. I think they'd have a good time. I'm bringing my kids. The other way you can help is you can go to this causeway. I think it's right above that link. And so this is an Indiegogo campaign to actually purchase the toys. And so the more money that goes into this, the more toys we can do. $20 buys a toy. It's a great way to help and make some kids happy. So anyway, thank you for listening.
Come on, a little bit more applause than that. That was embarrassing, guys. Yeah. Jeez. I know you have the will to power to give us some applause this afternoon. Okay, so our sponsors, these wonderful folks here are responsible for making sure that we get fed every week, and we do appreciate their wonderful sponsorship. Okay, no more faffing about. Sam here is going to come and talk to us today about Power BI. He's been in Chattanooga for about 4 years. Before that, he was out on the West Coast doing similar stuff to what he's doing now. He's a Power BI specialist and a software guy at TVA. So give it up for Sam, everybody.
All right. Hey, wow, this sounds a little loud. Thanks, Brett. Good afternoon. My name is Sumant. I go by Sam. I work at TVA, and today we're going to be looking at some Power BI. Right. All right, there we go. So before we get started, how many of you here have known or dealt with Power BI? All right, that's cool. And how many of you have dealt with Power add-ins for Excel, like Power Pivot? Okay, there we go. It's all over the place. Anyway, so here's the agenda for today. We're going to be looking at some history. The reason it's important is because a lot of us might have used Power BI in the past, not knowing that it is Power BI. So we're going to understand how we got to what Power BI is today. And then we're going to look at some components of Power BI, and finally we're going to look at some demos as well. And if you've got any questions, feel free to stop me and ask your question. All right. I apologize, my slides are like super minimalistic, not many graphics in there. So back in 2008, Microsoft had something known as Sandbox program. The idea was that people in Microsoft could propose ideas and Bill Gates would approve those. So one such idea was known as Power Pivot. Power Pivot is what we know as analysis services today. So if any of you have heard of SQL Server analysis services? Okay, so it uses an in-memory analytics engine that does data deduplication and stuff like that. So that is really what Power Pivot is under the hoods. It used to be available back in the day, and it is still available today as a free add-in for Excel. And then came Power View. Now, the funny thing is they kept renaming it every now and then. So a lot of things had, although they're the same today, they still have different names today. So you might have used it, but it might have a new name today. Then came Power View. So Power Pivot was used for data modeling. Power View was used for data visualizations. So you could basically pull in data from multiple sources into Excel and use Power View to sort of build charts in dashboards within Excel. And then came Power Query. So Power Query is an ETL tool, extract, transform, load. So it lets you bring in data from multiple sources, massage the data, mash the data, aggregate, transform, all that kind of stuff. So that is Power Query. And all of this is still today available as free add-ins for Excel. It's sort of complicated because Excel 2016 has all of this included out of the box, and Excel 2016 itself is not free, so it is a little complicated to say if it's available for free or not available for free. Anyway, the hosting, so once you built all these dashboards, you could host that on Office 365, or you could host that on premise SharePoint. It was sort of spread all over the place. I don't think there was a good vision or a roadmap, so I guess this is what they thought. They said, maybe it's too many, let's consolidate. So over time, we got Power BI. So started all the way back in 2008, and I would say 2015 September was when Power BI as a service was completely born. So this website has a lot of good information. Let's actually use Chrome. All right, so this is the official website for Power BI. Oh, my bad. Let's duplicate the screens. All right, there we go. So this is powerbi.microsoft.com. And there's a lot of good information here. So these are all the components of Power BI. First of all, Power BI really is a set of tools, or it's a suite of analytic tools. And we've got a cloud component. We've got several on-premise desktop components. We've got add-ins for Excel. So before we get into the demos, good that we understand what we're going to be looking at. Power BI, this is going to be the service. So this is where the dashboards or visualizations that we build are going to be hosted. So if we click on this, you can see that this is the cloud service, and all the visualizations or dashboards or reports that are developed on-premise get hosted there. And you could share this with your colleagues. You could share this outside your organization, or it's pretty cool. Power BI Desktop is the dashboard authoring tool. So this is what we use to create dashboards. This is what we use to build reports. And this also lets us pull in data from multiple sources. So Power BI Desktop is what we use to bring in data from sources, aggregate, build visualizations, and once we're happy with it, host it on the cloud. And then we have Power BI Mobile. So once you've hosted your reports and dashboards on the cloud, you could use your mobile devices to look at the dashboards as well. And finally, we have Power BI Embedded. So say you've hosted a dashboard on the cloud, and you want to include that in your website. You could do that using Power BI Embedded. So we're pretty much going to be looking at all of this. It's a little, there are too many components, to be honest, but it's really not that complicated. Any questions so far? I guess it's going to be much clearer once we start looking at it. But if you've got any questions, feel free. Yeah, so those are the components, and this is really what it lets you do. If you look at this again, so transform and clean data, this is done using the Power BI desktop. And then design once, view anywhere really is their motto. You basically design it, host it on the cloud. You could view it using any browser. You could use your mobile devices to view it and so on. So it's pretty good. And I would highly recommend if any of you guys want to try it, you could download it. It's free of cost. Most of what we're going to be seeing today, in fact, everything of what we're going to be seeing today can be done for no cost at all. They've got a free component, and they've got a paid version of it as well. The free version lets you deal with, I think they've got a pricing thing here yet. So if you look at this, the free one lets you create dashboards. You've got like a 1 gig of storage space online because the data that you bring in could potentially get moved to the cloud as well. And then you've got the pro service, which is mostly for enterprises and organizations. So say you've got an on-premise Oracle or SQL Server data source, and you've got your applications feeding in data into these databases, and you want to have a dashboard in the cloud that pulls in data continuously from the on-premise source. In such a case, you would need the pro service. So it's got more bells and whistles. But yeah, for most of what is needed, the free service is pretty much good. All right, so those really are the components. And so the next one would be, so this is what we're going to be looking at. The use case is a hungry developer. A hungry developer has two problems. So if I were to be hungry, one of the things that I would do is figure out which is the best place to go. And it's always a hard decision to make. The second problem is there's so much data available. So we've got websites such as Yelp, we've got Zomato, we've got tons of other resources as well. And I'm hungry as well. So the idea being each of these websites or each of these data sources offer some kind of APIs that we could use to pull in data, and that is what we're going to be looking at today. So Yelp is a website. I'm sure most of you would have heard of Yelp, and they offer a pretty good developer API. So we are going to be using Yelp as our source, and we'll see how we can use Power BI to do some kind of analysis on Yelp data and come up with a good decision on where we can go. So the reason it is a good candidate for this is if you look at this, there is no way you can actually do a side-by-side comparison. The only way you could really identify a good place to go and have your lunch or get a drink is to really click on this or go in here, search for something. So you don't really have all the data available at once, do some kind of analysis. So I think this is a perfect use case for this demo. Now, when it comes to their API, if we go to developers, they've got two flavors of the API. The first one is what they call the Fusion. It is just, it's packed with more features. But for our purpose, we're going to be using the API version 2. It uses OAuth authentication, and it's got a couple of endpoints. So it's pretty straightforward. All that you do is you pass in a set of query parameters in your request, and you get back data as JSON or XML, depending on what you want to get the data as. So we'll be using a couple of these APIs, see how we can connect to these sources, pull in the data, modify it, and do some good analysis. All right. Questions so far? Are we good? Okay. So yeah, this is the API. And what I've really done here is, if we go back to the slide, I've got a wrapper on top of this simply because I did not want to make it complicated and see how we do all the OAuth authentication. Rather, the wrapper is just a web API on my local machine. It wraps on top of the Yelp API. So if we were to go in here, you can see that I've got a web API project within Visual Studio, and it's pretty straightforward. It makes a call to the Yelp API service, brings in data, and just proxies it back to the caller. So what I've got here is Postman, and this lets me test those endpoints. So I've got an endpoint running on my machine at 6151 port, and the way it works is I make a call, I pass in the city, which is Chattanooga, and I could say I want to search for chats. I could just put this in there, make a call. It's going to call the Yelp service and proxy the data back to me. So you could see that we've got JSON data in here. But for the demo, we're actually going to be looking at, let's say we want to find good bars around Chattanooga, in and around Chattanooga. You can see that the JSON response that comes back is filled with complex objects. So we've got a lot of nesting here. You can see that the location itself is a complex object. It's got arrays in there. It's got nested objects in there. And you can see that we've got the names of these bars. And then they also have categories associated with it. So we can see categories such as pubs, bars, whatever. It's a fairly good set of data that we get back from the endpoint, but the only problem is that it is semi-structured. It's really not got a good schema. So if we were to just use this data and try to do some kind of analysis, it's really not that simple. What we really need to do is somehow take this JSON response, transpose it or transform it into a table, and then maybe use some kind of tool such as Excel or Power BI, whatever, to do the analysis. So for this purpose, we'll be using Power BI Desktop. Yeah, if you've got any questions before we start the demo. All right. So Power BI Desktop, like I said, is a free download. I've downloaded onto my machine. Click on that, it opens up. Let me close this. Have any of you used the Power BI Desktop yet? You have, okay, cool. The latest one? Okay. So the thing about Power BI is, unlike what Microsoft used to be back in the day, now it's very agile. So you've got a new release being made available for download every month. So this is the latest one that got, I think it was 2 days ago. So it's got a couple of bug fixes and whatnot. So when you open Power BI Desktop, which is free, by the way, you get this landing page. I'm just going to close this. And the look and feel is very straightforward. So it resembles any other Microsoft Office product. If you've used Excel, if you've used PowerPoint, any of those softwares, you would know how to deal with or how to use this software as well. It's got the same ribbons, and it's very simple to use, but it is packed with features. If we were to quickly compare this with, say, Excel as well, so I've got Excel 2016 on my machine. A lot of what is available inside this software is also available within Excel. So if I click on a blank workbook, open it up, you can see that I've got Power Pivot. And then if I go to Insert, you can see that I've got, oh yeah, so this is one thing that I forgot to mention. So there was something known as Power Maps. Have any of you heard of it before? So, okay, cool. Power Maps is Microsoft's three-dimensional spatial analysis add-in. It's really cool. We can look at that later if you guys are interested. Yeah, so all of these add-ins are available within Power BI Desktop as one single software. The reason I'm saying this is because if any of you want to use Excel as your primary analysis tool, you could still do that with the same set of add-ins. All right, so a quick tour of this desktop before we start doing the analysis. If any of you download this, the first thing I would recommend doing is to go under Options and Settings and look for the new features, because like I said, all the features that are made available this month stay in preview till the next release. So if you want to be one of those users who wants to test these new features before they're made available, you could just get in here and you could check these features. So this was made available this time during this release, and the grid lines in Snap to Grid, very good. So three things over here. The first one is the blank canvas. So this is where you can drag and drop your fields. This is where you can build your visualizations and so on. Over here is where we're going to be looking at the data itself. And then the third icon here is where we're going to be setting up the relationships. Over here on the top is where we get to Power Query. So if I click on blank query, it opens up a new window, and this is what is Power Query. This is where we're going to be doing all the ETL stuff. ETL being extract, transform, load. And finally, we have, there's no data in here. We could actually delete this. And on the top, we have data modeling. So this is a part of Power Pivot as well. And finally, on the right-hand side, we have visualizations. So we have got different kinds of charts, different kinds of filters, and so on. So the first thing we're going to be doing for this demo is we got to connect to the web surface somehow, and we got to bring in data. So when we want to do that, it's very similar to how we would do it in Excel. So in Excel, we've got the Get Data option. Click on that, and you get to see several different kinds of sources. So you can see over here that we've got plenty of sources. And they keep adding new source providers every other day. So you might want to keep checking their blog. And then you've got different kinds of file connectors. You've got databases, Azure, and so on. And so say you wanted to connect to an Oracle data source, you would select that and say, had to happen. All right, so we've got two options. By default, when you connect to a data source and you want to do analysis on that, Power BI imports the data into the workbook because it does in-memory analytics, like I said. But if you want to connect to a source and keep the data in the source, but just do the analysis within Power BI, then you could use something known as direct query. So it sets up a live connection with your source. But for today, we're just going to be importing all the data. So we know that we have our data available through a web service. So I'm going to say I want to get my data through web. And we've got the endpoint here. So I'm going to copy this endpoint address, put that in here. Now, if you wanted to pass in, say, additional information such as headers or maybe a web API key or a user token, whatever, then you could actually pass in HTTP request headers here. But for now, we just have a very basic web service that proxies data from the Yelp service. So I'm going to put the endpoint in here. And say OK. So what this is going to do is connect to the web service, make a call, and import the data. Now, this opens up Power Query. So Power Query is where we start working with the data. So we have sort of, this is where we were primarily working with. But now that we're dealing with the data, we are parsing the data, we are going to transform the data, and all of that is going to happen inside Power Query. So over here, you can see that the data is actually JSON. And it's basically taken the contents of this web service response, and it's parsed it into JSON. Now, one of the things that's important to know is Power Query has its own language. It's known as language M, which is a functional programming language. So if any of you have dealt with F# or any other language, it's pretty similar to that. It's not necessary to know this language, but it's going to help if you want to do some kind of complex transformations. So we're going to be seeing a little bit of language M as well, just to get you an idea of how you can deal with complex transformations. If we were to go back in here, you can see so up top, you can see this section that says region. And if I were to actually click on this, you can see the region over here. So it takes your JSON response and converts that into records. And then we've got businesses, which is an array. So it's taken the businesses and converted that into a list. For our demo, we don't really care about the region. We only care about the businesses. So I'm going to click on this. The moment I click on that, it's going to break that into an array of objects, with each object being a record. So this would actually translate into an object and its properties back in the JSON response itself. But over here, it's available as a record. Now, if you actually see on the right-hand side, every step that we're doing is actually getting translated into a step here. And behind the scenes, if we go to the top here and click on Advanced Editor, you can see that it's actually generating a formula for us. It's including a step in the script, and each step actually corresponds to a particular step. So, but we don't really have to write any of this unless otherwise needed. So now that we've got this in here, we can actually click on, we could just right-click and say to table. What this is going to do is each of those objects have properties. So when I say convert that into a table, it's going to convert those properties into fields. So if I actually expand this, you can now see that we've got all the properties made available as fields, which is pretty cool. I'm going to uncheck this option. All that it's going to do is it is going to prefix my column names with column 1 dot something. We don't really need that. So I'm going to uncheck that and say load more. So these are all the properties that are available within the JSON response. I'm going to select all of those and say OK. And you can see that it actually broke down the JSON response into a table, which is pretty cool. Now, if we were to do something like this in script, it's going to be pretty complicated, because I'm sure all of you at some point in time would have done similar sort of operations of trying to deserialize a JSON response or whatever. And it's always a pain when it gets to complex objects. So now that we've got all of the properties converted into fields, it's going to be much easier to do the analysis. You can see that we've got about 20 records, and we've got an ID column, which really is what Yelp considers as the primary key. So it's a unique identifier for every location or restaurant. So there can never be a repeating ID column across all of Yelp's data. So we can safely consider that to be our primary key or our unique identifier for locations. So let's actually bring this over to the left, because that's really the identifier. And when I did that, you can see that it added a new step on the right. It said reordered columns. And the next thing we can see is categories. You can see that for every single restaurant or every single bar, we've got a list of categories. That's because, let's look at social. So when I click on social and when I click on list, you can see that it's got 3 categories in here. Because a single location or a single establishment could be a bar, it could be a cocktail bar, it could be a wine bar, it could be a pub. So the way they categorize that is it's an array of values. So if we come back in here and let's look at any one of these. Yeah, if you see this one here, this is Tremont Tavern. You can see that it's got pubs as a category. It's also categorized as for breakfast. It's categorized as American. So what we're going to do now is actually get rid of this one. All right. And if we further scroll to the right, you can see that we've got a location. Location is, again, a complex object. It tells us, it gives us different information, such as what city it is, what is the lat, what is the long, and so on. So I think we've got a pretty good base query. What I like to do when I get to a good stage with formulating the queries is to create a base object. So I like to call this base query, and then use this as the foundation for other queries as well. So so let's call this base query, and now once we have this, I could duplicate it, and we could use this one to create our categories. So I could say category, and say I just select these two, right-click, and say remove other columns. So it gets rid of all the other columns. Now I could just click on this button here, click on it again, and you can see that it sort of denormalized the whole thing. So now we've got a single location or a single establishment, and we have all of the categories associated with that, which is pretty cool. The next thing we can do is duplicate this again. I'm sort of trying to normalize the data model just a bit so that the analysis would be simpler. If any of you don't really understand why I'm trying to do this, feel free to ask me. Is it sort of clear as to why we're trying to separate them out? It's to keep the establishments of the restaurants one per row, because we've got a one-to-many relationship between the categories and the businesses. So let me go ahead and duplicate this again, and this time we're going to be calling this as restaurants, or let's call this business, and say OK. So once we have this, we no longer need the categories because we already have categories in a separate table. So I'm going to remove this, but we still have the ID column here, and the category also has the ID column. So you can see that there's a relating field. So we go back in here, and we don't need the location here because a single restaurant or a single bar can have multiple attributes for location. So we're going to get rid of that. I could say remove. And the rest of the fields here have a one-to-one relationship between the establishment and the value itself. So I think we have a fairly good business table as well. I'm going to go ahead and say duplicate again. And this time we'll call this as location. And we don't need any of the other columns for locations. All that we need is the ID and the location itself. So what I'm going to do is select location and say move to beginning. So that's going to transfer the column over to the start. Now I could select these two and say remove other columns. So that's just going to leave us with the business ID and the location itself. Let me just bring this to the right. Come on. All right, there we go. Now if I could again click on this and say OK, which is going to expand all of the properties in the location object as fields of a table. And we don't really need the display address because we already have the address there. We could use that. So I'm going to say remove columns. Oops. So when you do a mistake such as this, all that you have to do to undo that is to click on this. So when you click on the undo icon over here, it's going to undo that step. I just meant to remove this column alone. And then we've got the coordinates here, so I could further expand that. It recognizes that that particular object has a lat and a long value. So I could select that and say, OK. It's going to break that down into 2 separate fields. And we still have, we don't really need the geo accuracy, so I'm going to remove that one as well. And finally, we have the address. So I could expand that one. But we have a problem. Did anyone see what, can anyone see what the problem is? So let me undo this. And if I click on this, we have more than 20 rows now. That's because there could be an address 1 and an address 2. And we don't really need that because we just need 1 row per location. So this is where it's good to know a little bit of language M, because it's going to help us with creating custom expressions. So what we're going to do is we're going to undo this step. And let's go to add column. So on the top, you can see that we've got plenty of options. It's going to take a long time to go through each one of those, but they're pretty obvious in terms of what they're called and what they do. But what we're going to do now is create a new column and add an expression there to concatenate address 1 and address 2 into a display address. So I could just say custom column. And when this opens up, I could give it a name. I'm just going to stick with the names that we already have. I wouldn't typically be using underscores for names, but for now, let's just say display underscore address is the name. We've got the address column, which has more than 1 value in there. So what we could do is I could say table.fromList, and we could choose the address field and say, OK. Actually, you know what? Let's just say, actually, let's do this first. List.count of address. And when I do that, you can actually see it's counting the number of values in each one of those arrays. So if people can't see it, let me bring that here. You can see that for social, I suppose, which one has 2? Yeah, 2, 10, Jack. You can see that it's got 2 values there. So this basically, all that this is doing is it's counting the number of values in each one of those arrays. So I could cancel this out. And when I come back in here, I could just say table.fromList, select the address, and I'm going to tell you why I'm doing this very soon. Table.transpose. Then I'm going to say table.toList. Then I could say combiner. So let's just click on OK and see what happens here. And if we go back to the custom column, so what we're doing here is we know that the address field is an array. It's got 2 values, or it could have 3 values. I'm saying table.fromList, which basically takes a list of values and converts that into a table. The reason I'm doing that is because table has a transpose function, which essentially transposes all the values. And then I'm converting that back into an array. But this time, I'm concatenating those values in the array using a delimiter. It's sort of, it might look a little complicated, but if you look at those expressions or if you understand the formulas itself, it's pretty straightforward. So let's just say, OK, and let's give this a name of display address. Let's It's interesting. Oh, I had one before. So once we have this column, we no longer need the other one, so I could go ahead and get rid of that. So I could just say remove. Now we've got the locations as well. So we've got all the columns, all the tables that we need. I could just say close and apply. And when I do that, it's going to load all the data into the model itself. We did not need the base query because we're really not using it. So we could come back. We could just say edit query. And once we come in here, we could say disable the load, which is not going to load that in there. So again, close and apply. And once we have this, we could set up relationships between those tables. So if I say Autodetect, it's going to identify the ID columns between all the tables and going to connect them. And now we've got all the fields that we need. And so now if I drag and drop these fields, click on View, click on Show Grid Lines, snap to grid. You can see we've got all these fields. Click on the Filter button. And then you could, let's say we want to see a map. Click on the map. And this needs the latitude and the longitude. We've got those values here. So I could just drag and drop that there. I could drag and drop that here. And you can see that we've got data on the map. Expand this. Now if we click on this, you can see that it starts refreshing. And then you could further bring in the name. And let's say you want to see how many reviews you've got for locations. So you could put that in there. Expand it. And now let's say we want to see bars in Chattanooga. Just click on that. You can see the location. You can see the data in the table itself refresh. Now, if you want to further get fancy, you could go in here and you could expand business. And you see that we've got a lot of images as well. So you could select this and categorize that as image URL. And now if we go back to our visualization, and let's say I select the rating image URL and drag and drop that there. So it converts that into an image as well, which is pretty cool. And finally, once we've got it to a fairly good shape, you could publish it. So you could go to home and you could click on publish, which is us saying that we want to share it with other people. So you could give this as demo dashboard. And it's going to ask us for a location where we want to publish it. Any questions? All right. So now if I just click on that, it's actually published it to the cloud. And it's going to open that up here. And over here, it's created a data set for us. I could simply select this one and say I want to pin it to a dashboard. And I could say I want to create a new dashboard. And I might want to call this as Yelp analysis. So now we've got a dashboard as well. And the nice thing here is it's got something known as question and answer, sort of natural language querying. So I could say, show me name by location. With rating count, with rating of 4. So you're essentially having a conversation with the model. So there's so much more possible, but you can see that we actually got like the semi-structured data set into Power BI, modeled it out using Power Query, built visualizations, created a dashboard, hosted it, and we're essentially able to talk to the dashboard. And the same thing's going to be available on the mobile as well. So it's a free app for your phone as well. So that's Power BI at a high level. There's so much more around it: collaboration, security, more features. But I hope this sort of gives you an idea of how you can use Power BI. Any questions? I think we've got just a few more minutes. Yeah. Uh-huh. It's just a C-sharp
Can you repeat his question?
assembly, and it's got a web API project, an ASP.NET project.
Just repeat the questions as they come in, so our live streamers
So
can
the
hear.
question was, what was the integration layer that was being used between Yelp and Power BI? How was it done? And the answer to that was, it's a C-sharp project, and it's got a web API project as well. And that's hosted locally using IIS.
Seems like a pretty cool tool for transforming data. Can you target things? Target things besides dashboards and cloud visualization? Can you target other databases and say, hey, take this JSON and normalize it into something that's more useful in a database or something?
You could, but you cannot push data back into the database if that's what you're asking. It's going to be read-only. Yeah. But you could bring in data from a relational database, bring in data from JSON, join those two together, and do all that kind of stuff. But there's no way you can push it back. Yeah.
This is the last one.
So I hate to repeat a similar question. So you can't push data back. Can you export it in just a flat format?
You could, yeah. Each one of these visualizations actually have an export option. You could do that. Or the other cool thing you can do is you can take the entire model and host that as an analysis services database itself. So you can do that. Right. Oh, so the location had a latitude and a longitude. Along with that, it also had an address field. It was address 1 and address 2. So it was like, that's the way Yelp actually returns the data. Not really. So for instance, let's quickly look at, let's look at social. And if you look at the address for this one, if you look at this section over here, you can see that the address actually has 1110 Market Street, Suite 103. So it's just their way of returning the data. But we really want to display that as just one single address, which is a concatenation of address 1 and address 2. No, it's just going to repeat. It's one address. It's like a suite. Yeah, a secondary address here. It's like a street 1 street. Yeah, yeah. Like an apartment number, if that were to be there, that's going to show up. Yeah.
All right. Do you have time to stick around in case there's any other questions? Give it up for Sam, guys. Really appreciate that. I want to make sure everybody has time to get back to work. Come back next week. We've got Sam Linsgraf coming in and talking to us about a novel, a 3D printing path algorithm that he's developed, and it's won some awards for the paper that he